Hari Om. Om Tvameva Mata Cha Pita Tvameva Bandhuscha Sakha Tvameva Vidyadravinam Tvameva Sarvam Mama Deva Deva. Thou art our loving mother. Thou art our compassionate father. Thou art our true friend and constant companion. Thou art our only treasure, and thou art our only wisdom. Thou art all in all. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace. Our subject this morning, effort and grace. Let me quote to you a passage from the Upanishads. The self is not known through the study. The self is not known through study of the scriptures, nor through subtlety of the intellect, nor through much learning. Whom the self chooses, by him is he attained. Verily, unto him does the self reveal his true being. Then again we read in the Christian scripture, the Bible, Jesus says, "Ye have not chosen me, but I have chosen you." Now you read any scripture in the world and you find that this has been pointed out, that ultimate knowledge of God, or the illumined knowledge of God, the vision of the Spirit, that can be had only through the grace of God. Any great soul who has attained to that illumination, or even anyone who at any period of his time becomes absorbed even for a moment in the consciousness of God, he would tell you that it is not by his effort that he attained to that state, but it is through divine grace. It is something that is a psychological and mystical experience. Now, of course, you find that almost every religion has an aspect called theology. And in theology, they try to make a doctrine out of this, the doctrine of grace. And then, if anybody tries to make a doctrine out of it, there arises many difficulties. Now, before we come to that, you see, of course, the main difficulty arises. The question comes, if it depends upon the grace of God, does it mean then that God is partial? He withholds his grace and he showers his grace according to his whims? Then naturally we begin to think, then what is the necessity for self-effort at all? And all these ideas cannot be reconciled from a theological standpoint at all. Only the understanding what this divine grace is comes to you if you are a mystic, if you are a spiritual aspirant. Then you directly experience this grace, and on what conditions this grace is experienced, you will know for yourself. And you will realize then that the grace is unconditional also. So it is from a psychological and mystical standpoint that we can explain this whole idea of grace. No philosophy, no theology can give us any reason for this. And you see, grace has no reason. It is something that you have to experience. Now, of course, let us try to understand, in the first place, why is it that we have to have that illumined knowledge of God? What is the psychology behind it? What is the truth behind it? That question arises first. Now here, again, we have theological doctrines. For instance, in Judaism and Christianity, you have the doctrine of sin and salvation. And in Hinduism and Buddhism, you have the doctrine of ignorance and law of karma. So, I will not go into the theology of it, but I will try to explain that also from a psychological standpoint. You see, in theology, for instance, in Judaism and Christianity, you have the doctrine of sin. And how this sin came, they try to explain that through mythology. Now, in Hinduism and Buddhism, they have the doctrine of ignorance, how we are born in ignorance. But how this ignorance came, no theology, no philosophy can explain. So instead of trying to understand that from a theological or philosophical standpoint, let us try to understand the whole situation from a psychological standpoint. Of course, they point out that there is sin and there is salvation from it. And in order to attain that salvation, you have to have the illumined knowledge of God. Of course, that is not what is preached by the modern Christianity, but because they evade the issue by saying, as you make your decision for Christ, then you are taken care of in the afterlife. You attain to heaven. But of course, Hinduism and Buddhism insist upon having that knowledge and that illumined knowledge of God while living on earth. And if we read the teachings of Christ, it is the same truth that he taught. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Now let us try to understand this from a psychological standpoint. And it is an experience with every one of us that we have limitations. We feel limitations. And then the experience of suffering and misery is a universal experience. No philosophy is needed to prove that. Something common to mankind. Now again, there is something common to mankind, something universal, and that is, we do not like these limitations. We do not like to live in suffering and misery. And there is ever this struggle to overcome suffering, misery, and limitations. Though it is true that we from our own psychological experience, we see death. But yet, we want to overcome death. Instinctively there arises that urge to overcome death. There is suffering and misery, but we cannot believe. None of us can believe, whether he is a sinner or a saint. None of us can take for granted that we have to live in suffering and misery. There must be a way out of it. And it is only, of course, religion points out to us. You see there, again, religion which is an experience, which is based upon experience. And all religions are based upon experience. And it is these souls who have experienced that truth, they point out to us that there is a stage, there is an attainment where you realize your freedom from all limitations and freedom from all sufferings and miseries. And there is the attainment of a positive joy, positive bliss. So from a psychological standpoint, you see, you don't need any belief in theology or anything like that. But this is something universally experienced. We all experience limitations, bondages, sufferings, miseries. And we all want to get out of sufferings and miseries. And how? We have to follow there. Those who have attained that, those who express, who manifest that also in their lives. And examples are not wanting. Now again, the fundamental truth, in order that we can attain to that state, the fundamental truth that we have to consider is just this. There are two propositions. God is, and that we can realize our union with Him. And it is in that realization that there is the attainment of that freedom and that transcendental bliss. So these are the two hypotheses, if you please, that we have to accept. Now, again, why? What proof is there that God is? Here again, you try to give theological proofs or philosophical arguments or even scientific arguments. That's not convincing. Because whenever you try to give the proof for the existence of God, you have to define God. What kind of a God? You see, the very first proposition, in order that you have to prove God, you have to define what God is. Now, is that possible? Is any definition of God possible? The moment you define, He is no longer God. But you find in every religion, in every theology, there is the attempt to prove the existence of God. There is the attempt to define God. Only in Vedanta and Buddhism, there is not that attempt made. And that is why, again, especially Buddhism is often misunderstood, that it is atheistic or agnostic, but it is not so. Now then, where is the proof? What is the real proof for the existence of God? In the second proposition, that He can be known, He can be realized. And in that realization, as I pointed out, there is the attainment of that which we are seeking universally. Now again, the next proposition that comes, where can we find that God? Of course, we have to have some idea of that. And each one of us tries to form certain conception, certain idea of God. You know, many times people say, there are thinkers and intellectuals who say, I can't believe in a God. But if he analyzes, he will find that he only does not believe in a God that another defines what God is. In other words, he does not believe in a conception of God given by any theology or given by any individual. That is all. Because there can be no atheist at all. I have often expressed that idea. There cannot be any atheist. Who is an atheist? He says there is no God. How does he know? Can he be sure that there is no God? Nobody can be sure. So he can be an agnostic. And sometimes it's better to begin as an agnostic, but you have to be an inquirer into it. You have to inquire into it. Do not remain satisfied being an agnostic. Now, as we inquire into it, then, of course, you have to experiment, because it is an experimental psychology. And I've often said that religion and mysticism are not distinct. There can be no religion without mysticism. Religion becomes a theory. If, along with that, there is not that struggle to experience the truth for one's own self. Now, to come to the point, where is God? Where do we find it? Anybody who has attained to that realization finds God within his own self. And then you read any scripture, you will find it is taught how kingdom of God is within. Now, St. Augustine gave a beautiful definition of this, of God. He said, God is a circle whose center is everywhere, but circumference nowhere. Beautifully expressed. Is a circle whose center is everywhere, but circumference nowhere. You know, when I was a little boy at one time, we were discussing about where is the center of the earth. Then someone put his foot down and said, here is the center of the earth. And that is true. Same way, where is the center of God? Here, within each soul. In the Upanishads we read, an air, though one, takes the shape of every object it enters, so the self, though one, takes the shape of any object in which it dwells. It's the one God, who is the center in every heart, assumes all these different forms, names and forms, this whole universe. And Vedanta points out definitely what that center is, what that God is. Not that Vedanta tries to define, but definitely indicates what it is. And that the Vedanta calls it the Atman, or the self. And that is why, again, you see, there is no proof needed for the existence of God. Because before you can find any proof, or before you can question for the proof for anything, you have to exist. It's self-evident. Now, in other words, to be more precise, that God within you, or that real self, is encased in sheaths. You see, you are the center of God. I am the center of God. Everywhere in the universe is the center of God. There is the presence of God in His infinite degree everywhere. Now, when it comes to individual man, there is God within. He is the center. Encased in this sheath of a body, mind, senses, ego, intellect. And so we classify them into physical body, subtle body, causal body. These are bodies, sheaths. Now, you see, we can find out then what is really that element that everybody knows that there is. That element which we can define from our standpoint as God. It is said to be consciousness, intelligence, pure consciousness. You see, we all know that this body is not intelligent, is not conscious, but you see, every cell is conscious. Every cell of this body is conscious, unless paralyzed. But still man can live. So you see, the consciousness is not the property of the body. It's a borrowed something, but we feel it. Then take the mind. You may think mind is conscious. In Western psychology they point out how mind is conscious, but mind is not conscious. The consciousness in the mind is a borrowed consciousness. Because you all know how you become unconscious in deep sleep. If the consciousness had been the property of the mind would always be conscious. So the mind is expressing that consciousness, that intelligence, but that of God percolating through mind. You see, there is a saying of Sri Ramakrishna that the policeman with his bull's-eye lantern in darkness sees everything, but nobody sees him. So it is with the light of God, with the pure consciousness of God, that the mind, senses, body become conscious and this whole universe becomes revealed. But the knower, the experiencer, the God within remains unknown. And in our three states of consciousness, waking, dreaming, and dreamless sleep, so though there is that consciousness percolating all the time, forever, still that consciousness itself remains unknown. And yet again, we have to know that God. We have to realize that God. And it is pointed out in every religion how we have to transcend these three states of consciousness. We have to be born anew, as it were. And this birth comes through the grace of God. Now then, the main point is this, that there is the divinity, God within us, covered by darkness or ignorance. But where is this ignorance? Psychologically again. You see, it is the mind that is either awake or dreaming or goes to deep sleep. And it is the mind that unites us with this ignorance. In other words, where is this ignorance? It's in the mind. The Atman is shining equally upon all. God is not partial to anybody. God does not look into your good or bad. That's within law of karma. But He is impartial, self-luminous, shining within. And He takes no note of the merit or demerit of anybody, as is said in the Gita. Now, the ignorance is in the mind. And the fact is, why is that ignorance there? You see, God dwells equally in every being, but our mind, or we, do not dwell equally in Him. So here, that effort is most important. You see, it is with the help of the mind, again, that we have to unite ourselves with God. And you see, it is just like this. God is like a magnet in each one of us. Mind is like the point of a needle, but covered with dirt. And so the needle, the point of the needle, does not feel that attraction of the magnet. Now, somehow remove this covering. Immediately that point of the needle feels that attraction of the magnet and unites itself. Another illustration is given by Sri Ramakrishna. The breeze of grace is blowing. Set sail to catch that breeze. So, you have to make effort to catch that breeze. But that breeze is blowing all the time equally. So there is the grace. And that grace is equal. Same with everybody, to everybody, sinner or saint. This sinner has his mind covered with dirt and dust. That is what sin is. It is not the true nature of the mind also. Now, who is a saint? One who has removed that covering. So again it is pointed out in the Gita, what is man's will and how shall he use it? Let him put forth its power to uncover the Atman, not hide the Atman. Man's will is the only friend of the Atman. His will is also the Atman's enemy. There's another beautiful passage in the Gita, that he who makes an attempt, he who yearns for me, I endow him with an intelligence through which he comes to me. In other words, if you make a little attempt to find God, you find that grace also. And it becomes a psychological and mystical experience in the individual. There is a saying, if you take one step towards God, he comes down 10 steps towards you. You see, that reminds me one time, I complained to my master that how he gives lessons, gives us teachings, and it ends there. He does not see. He does not help us. Then his answer was, do you practice what I asked you to practice? If you do, then you will realize that we are helping you. And that's the truth. That's the fact. In other words, you make an attempt. Then you find the grace of God and the grace of his saints descending upon you. You feel that. And my master often quoted this saying, well-known saying, you have the grace of Guru, grace of God, grace of his devotees, but for the grace of one, you may be ruined. What is that grace of one? Grace of your own mind. In other words, without that effort, certain effort on our part, this grace cannot be felt. It's not a matter of doctrine, but it is a matter of experience. Now, a spiritual aspirant does not feel that grace all at once. So there are stages of growth. In this connection, let me point out that perhaps Buddha was the greatest psychologist in this respect, because he didn't talk of this grace, because he knew that it is something to be experienced. It is something that a mystic can experience. But in order that you can be a real mystic, you have to make that attempt. And so he emphasized upon struggle. Be lamps unto yourselves. You have to be a lamp unto yourself. And that same truth is emphasized in the Gita. You are your own friend. You are your own enemy. So that effort is most needed. And to begin with, you have to have that effort. Of course, again, I must say that it depends upon the individual evolution or evolution of the individual man. Because every man does not seek for God. There is that feeling of limitation in everybody. It's a universal feeling. But everybody does not feel that he has to find God to attain that freedom. He still thinks that in this relative plane, through the senses, through his intelligence, he can find that freedom. So one has to come to a certain growth. And it is pointed out in our scriptures how, you see, a man has to go through all kinds of experiences before that dispassion for the objects and things of the world arises and love for God grows. There is a saying. But the difficulty is that almost every human being has had all kinds of experiences. After all, how many kinds of experiences can you expect with your five senses? And the same things are repeated over and over again. That is the difficulty. Swami Vivekananda gave this illustration that the bee came to suck the honey, but its feet got stuck in the honey. And so neither can get out of it nor can enjoy it, can't suck anymore. That's the difficulty. So you have to have certain growth. There has to come that certain growth, and that growth comes again through discrimination. Discriminate. Yes, you are seeking happiness, you are seeking life, you are seeking the joy of life. But can this object, can these objects of the world give you? Have that discrimination. So you become first a pravartak, or a beginner. And a beginner inquires. He studies, he reads, he goes here, he goes there. He tries to find a teacher, goes to this teacher and that teacher. Goes on inquiring. Then he becomes convinced that here is the truth. And where does he find that truth? How does he become convinced where to find that truth? You see, first he thinks this teacher can give him, that teacher can give him, or this particular religion can give him, or that particular religion can give him. He seeks everywhere. Then at long last he realizes that the truth can be only found within one's own self, nowhere else. Then he becomes a real spiritual aspirant. Mumukshu is desiring for that. Of course, that intense desire, intense yearning has not arisen. Now, the moment there comes that aspiration, that desire, you begin to get help, as it were. Then you begin to feel that grace. But sometimes you feel that, sometimes you don't feel that. Then naturally, with that grace, you begin to practice spiritual disciplines. Simply desiring will not do. You have to do something about it. And so, naturally, you find out that you have to practice certain spiritual disciplines and devote yourself to God. And there are certain common universal disciplines which every individual can find out for himself, and which are, for instance, chastity, truthfulness, not to be greedy. You see, things like that, ethical principles or moral principles which are common and universal and which we feel in our heart of hearts is true. Then again, in order that your mind can be established in that, you have to regulate yourself. You have to practice with regularity certain disciplines. For instance, there is what is known as study. Study means again to chant the name of God, to surrender your life to God, to practice self-surrender. Then you are active, you do work, and give the fruits of actions to God. In other words, the whole ideal is to give your mind to God, to make the attempt to give your mind to God. As you make that struggle, make that attempt, you see, you are struggling. You are making that effort. If you simply not do anything and wait for the grace, it never comes. You never feel it. So you are making this self-effort. And then you come to a stage when within this effort also you begin to feel the grace. As you go to practice prayer, meditation, or as you are doing action, and in your action you are offering to God, you begin to feel that you are doing all this through the grace of God. Sometimes it happens this way. You feel lazy. Then somebody says, now get up. You have to do this. You are goaded, as it were. And the spiritual aspirant, I would say, from the very beginning begins to feel a little grace. And then, through such practices, you come to a conviction, to a feeling, to an experience that He is so near to us. The Sri Ramakrishna has given this illustration. You enter into a room, dark room, where you begin to feel your beloved is there lying. But you don't see him, but you can feel that there is that presence. And the same way, that presence is felt though you do not have the vision yet, though you have not realized your union, but you begin to feel that presence, living presence of God. And when you begin to feel this living presence of God, then what happens is a very direct experience of that grace. As if a power, another power. You see, it is the power of God, it is the power of self within. But at this moment, you have no idea whether this power is outside or inside. You see, that you can never find out. But you are struck by a power. You are drawn by a power. And then this whole vision disappears. This whole delusion disappears. And you are face to face with God. There comes that illumined knowledge of God. And at that moment, naturally, that grace is felt so directly and immediately and so tangibly. You see, there is no theory there. No theological doctrine is needed there. But it's a direct experience, as if somebody holds you by the hand and throws you there. And you are face to face with that reality, with God. And that is, you see, just as a magnet draws, you feel that drawing, that attraction. Now again, we understand that all struggles have that one end in view. And what is it? To remove the dirt and dust of the mind. That's all. You see, you are hungering for God. But it depends upon the grace of God. All you can do is to purify your heart and mind. There's a subtle philosophical discussion that is brought out in the philosophy of Shankara. And Shankara also, gives great stress upon self-effort. And then the question arose, that is, his opponent pointed out, but look here. God realization, that attainment is something that is not finite or limited. That attainment is something infinite, everlasting, eternal. How can finite struggles lead you there, which is something infinite. Then Shankara had to admit this, that our finite struggles have that one end in view, to remove the ignorance which is finite. You see, our the ignorance or the sin or whatever you may call it, your bad karmas or the impurities of the mind, they are not infinite, they are finite. And so with finite struggles you remove that. And then the light shines. Then he gives illustration. Take the self-luminous sun. The luminosity is there. One patch of cloud covering that. Now, another patch of cloud comes and dashes against that cloud and goes away, both. Then the luminosity of the sun becomes revealed the same way. The mind, there is the accumulation of impurities in the mind. By pure deeds, by pure thoughts, remove those. Then you go beyond all struggles. There is no more struggle. And all struggles, all efforts are within ignorance also. Here comes a great misunderstanding amongst some teachers of Vedanta as well as what you call Zen Buddhism. In Vedanta also there is that misunderstanding that I am God, I am the infinite, eternal being. I am ever like that. So I have nothing to do. I am God. And any struggle or anything you do is within Maya, within ignorance. Meditation also is within ignorance, good deeds within ignorance, and forgetfulness of God is within ignorance, and evil deeds within ignorance. So, why again follow the ignorance? So meditation also is within ignorance, and as such you must not meditate, but just I am. This is a complete misunderstanding of the teachings. The fact is this, that Maya or ignorance has two aspects. In one aspect it creates bondage, in another aspect it relieves you from bondage. And so you take the help of one aspect to remove the other aspect, and then you don't need both. Don't need either. Sri Ramakrishna gave the illustration of thorn getting into your body. So you take the help of another thorn to take out that thorn that is in your body, and then you throw away both thorns. So that effort is needed to remove the ignorance. And then you begin to feel that breeze of grace all the time, 24 hours. You feel that breeze of grace. You live in that grace. And of course you live in that bliss of union with God. Om Hari Om. Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya. Tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityorma amritangamaya, abir maidhi, rudrajate dakshinang mukhang, te namang pahi nityam. Om. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from death to immortality. Lead us from darkness to light. Light us through and through, and guide us evermore with thy loving presence. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace,